Marcus gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove through the unfamiliar streets of his new city. The roads stretched out ahead of him, lined with houses and small shops, each one unfamiliar yet full of potential. Beside him, his wife, Jasmine, sat quietly, her eyes scanning the passing scenery. She seemed lost in thought, taking in every detail of the neighborhood they hoped to call home. For Marcus, this wasn't just a move, it was a fresh start. After years of setbacks and struggles, this was their chance to leave the past behind and build a better future. But with every mile, a knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach, mixing with the flicker of excitement he felt. The possibilities seemed endless, but so did the uncertainties. Jasmine finally broke the silence, offering a small smile. "It feels different here," she said, almost as if trying to convince herself. Marcus nodded, though he couldn't shake the tension growing within him. He wanted to believe in this new beginning, but something in the back of his mind warned him that change often came with challenges. As they turned a corner, the moment of peace was interrupted. A police car sat parked nearby, its presence impossible to ignore. As Marcus turned onto a quieter street, his gaze flickered toward the rearview mirror. There it was, a police car parked at the corner. His grip on the wheel tightened. The officers inside seemed to be watching him closely, their eyes following his car with a sharp, heavy suspicion he had felt too many times before. Trying to stay calm, he focused on the road ahead, but the knot of unease in his chest tightened. He didn't say a word to Jasmine, who was still admiring the neighborhood. He didn't want to alarm her, but the tension in his shoulders said it all. As the seconds stretched on, the flash of red and blue lights suddenly lit up behind him. The piercing sound of the siren broke the stillness. "Pull over." The commanding voice boomed from the police car's loudspeaker. Marcus sighed deeply, his heart pounding. "Seriously?" he muttered under his breath. He glanced at Jasmine, who instantly tensed up, worry etched on her face. Without hesitation, he steered the car to the side of the road. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, and deep down, he knew it might not be the last. The officers stepped out of their car, their movements brisk and their expressions cold. Marcus didn't need to hear their words to understand the look in their eyes. It wasn't just a routine stop. He could feel the judgment, the assumptions, and the power they thought they held as they approached. One of the officers, a tall man with a stiff posture and a cold glare, marched toward Marcus's window. His tone was sharp and unfriendly. "License and registration." "Now," he demanded without any greeting or explanation. Marcus nodded, keeping his movements calm and steady, though his stomach churned with unease. He handed over the requested documents, knowing all too well what this stop was really about. The officer snatched the papers, barely glancing at Marcus, and started flipping through them carelessly. His partner, a younger officer with an equally dismissive attitude, leaned in slightly. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his words carrying more accusation than curiosity. Marcus kept his tone steady. "We're moving here," he replied, glancing briefly at Jasmine, who was sitting rigidly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The younger officer chuckled mockingly. "Moving, huh? Where to?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm as his eyes flicked toward Jasmine, filled with an unwelcome suspicion. The disrespect in their words and mannerisms was hard to miss. Marcus clenched the steering wheel tighter, his irritation bubbling beneath the surface. He knew they weren't interested in answers, they were interested in power. "Is this car yours?" the first officer asked, his voice casual, but his expression anything but. Marcus felt his patience thinning, but he kept his expression neutral. "Yes, it's mine." "Is there a problem?" he asked, locking eyes with the officer. The man's lips twitched, clearly irritated by Marcus's calm response. Meanwhile, the younger officer, circling the car like a predator, suddenly stopped by Jasmine's door. He didn't ask. He ordered. "Step out of the car," he said, his tone flat and commanding. Jasmine hesitated, her eyes darting to Marcus for reassurance. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. He knew arguing would only make things worse. Slowly, she opened the door and stepped out. The officer wasted no time, running his hands over her and patting her down in a way that felt more like a statement than a genuine search. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay silent. "What's in the trunk?" the younger officer barked. Without waiting for an answer, he moved to the back and began rummaging through their belongings. Clothes, books, and personal items were tossed aside like trash. Jasmine stood stiffly nearby, her fists clenched at her sides. The older officer, still holding Marcus's documents, leaned closer. "People like you don't usually drive cars like this," he said with a smirk. Marcus could hear the venom in his voice, the unspoken insult hanging in the air. "People like me?" Marcus repeated, his tone steady but sharp. He could feel Jasmine's eyes on him, silently pleading for him to stay calm. "Don't get smart with me," the older officer snapped, stepping back with a sneer. "You don't want to make this worse for yourself." Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. He knew what this was, a power play, fueled by prejudice, and he wasn't about to let it break him. Marcus knew the situation was escalating, and he had to tread carefully. The younger officer slammed the trunk shut and marched back toward him. "Get out of the car!" he demanded, his voice sharp and filled with authority. Jasmine looked at Marcus, worry etched across her face. Marcus nodded to her before slowly stepping out, his hands visible and movements deliberate. As soon as he stood up, the older officer stepped closer, invading his space. "If you're clean, why do you look so nervous?" The officer sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He glanced around and noticed a few neighbors peeking out from behind curtains, drawn by the commotion. "Officers," Marcus began, keeping his voice calm but firm, "you don't have a reason for this stop. This is harassment." The older officer crossed his arms, a smug smile on his face. "No reason? We'll see about that after we're done here," he replied, clearly enjoying the control he thought he had. Marcus clenched his fists by his side but forced himself to keep his composure. The injustice of the moment felt suffocating, but he knew he couldn't lose control. The officers didn't just see him as a man, they saw him as a target. He stood tall, determined not to let them break his spirit. Little did they know, they were about to learn just who Marcus Foster really was. The older officer moved closer, standing just inches from Marcus. His smug expression showed he believed he had full control. "You don't seem to understand the situation," he said coldly. "We ask the questions, and you answer. Now tell us, why are you here?" Marcus felt a surge of frustration, but he remained composed. "I've already told you." "We're moving here," he replied, his voice steady but firm. The younger officer scoffed, shaking his head. "People like you always have something to hide," he said, his words cutting through the air. Marcus stared at him, the weight of years of similar encounters pressing down on him. "People like me?" he asked, his tone sharp but controlled. "Don't get smart with me." The older officer barked, stepping even closer. His face was twisted in anger, but Marcus stood his ground. The younger officer folded his arms, smirking as he leaned toward Marcus. "Get out of the car," he ordered again, his tone laced with arrogance. Marcus gave Jasmine a reassuring glance before stepping out slowly. He kept his hands visible, knowing how dangerous the wrong move could be. As he stood, the older officer pressed his chest against Marcus. "If you're innocent, why are you so nervous?" he taunted. Marcus looked around, noticing more neighbors watching from their windows. He knew this wasn't just about him, it was a reflection of something much bigger. Taking a deep breath, he locked eyes with the older officer. "This stop is unjustified," Marcus said firmly. "You have no reason for this." The officers exchanged glances, their confidence faltering. But Marcus knew he wasn't done. He was ready to show them exactly who they were dealing with. The situation was growing more intense, and Marcus could feel the officers pushing their limits. The older officer smirked and crossed his arms. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" he said with mock authority. "You're in no position to demand anything." Marcus's patience was wearing thin, but he knew better than to let his emotions take control. Instead, he stood his ground, his voice firm but calm. "You've already searched the car and found nothing. This stop has no purpose. What more do you need?" The younger officer stepped closer, his face filled with disdain. "Watch your tone," he sneered, trying to intimidate Marcus. He glanced at Jasmine, who stood nearby, her worried eyes fixed on Marcus. "Sir," Marcus began again, addressing the officers clearly, "this isn't about following the law. This is about something else, and we all know it." The older officer chuckled darkly. "You've got a smart mouth, don't you? Let's see how smart you are when we take you in for questioning." But Marcus wasn't backing down. He looked at the officers directly, refusing to be silenced. "I'm not going anywhere unless you have a legitimate reason," he stated boldly. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado cracking under Marcus's unwavering resolve. Marcus knew the tide was beginning to shift, and soon they would realize they were the ones who had overstepped their bounds. The tension in the air was thick, but Marcus stayed calm. He could feel the eyes of the neighbors peering from their windows, curious about the unfolding scene. The older officer, now visibly irritated, took another step forward. "You really don't want to make this harder on yourself," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. Marcus, refusing to be intimidated, met his gaze. "Harder on myself?" he replied, his voice steady. "You're the ones creating this situation without any cause." The younger officer, clearly annoyed by Marcus's confidence, leaned closer. "What's in the car, huh? Drugs? Weapons? You think we don't know what people like you are up to?" His words were sharp, laced with prejudice that Marcus had heard far too often. Jasmine, standing by the car, clenched her fists but said nothing. Marcus gave her a quick glance, silently reassuring her to stay calm. "You've searched the car," Marcus said firmly. "You found nothing because there's nothing to find. This stop is unjustified." The older officer smirked, trying to regain control. "We'll decide what's justified," he shot back. "Now, unless you want this to get worse, you'd better start cooperating." But Marcus wasn't about to back down. "I have been cooperating," he replied, his voice unwavering. "The problem isn't me, it's your bias." For a moment, the officers seemed caught off guard by Marcus's calm defiance. The power they thought they held was beginning to waver, and Marcus could see it. Marcus knew he was walking a fine line, but he wasn't about to let fear control him. The older officer leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you so nervous? You're acting like you've got something to hide," he said, his tone sharp and condescending. Marcus took a slow breath, steadying himself. "Nervous," he replied, locking eyes with the officer. "I'm frustrated because I've done nothing wrong. Yet here we are." The younger officer scoffed. "Oh, so now you're the victim? People like you always have an excuse." His words carried the sting of deep prejudice, but Marcus didn't flinch. Jasmine, standing nearby, tightened her grip on the strap of her bag. Marcus noticed and gave her a reassuring nod, silently telling her he had everything under control. "Look," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm but firm, "you've searched the car, questioned us, and found nothing. Isn't it time you let us go?" The older officer chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't tell us when this ends," he sneered. "We'll leave when we're satisfied." Marcus felt his patience thinning, but he stayed composed. "Satisfied with what?" he asked, his voice unwavering. "You've made up your minds about me before even stopping this car." The officers exchanged a glance, their confidence starting to waver. For the first time, Marcus noticed hesitation in their eyes. He knew he was getting through, even if they wouldn't admit it.